How's it going, everybody? Back here with another tier list. But before we jump directly into the tier list, let's talk about a couple housekeeping things. First up, we have a 10-hour stream coming up in about 2 weeks over at twitch.tv/darthjacen. This is a reward for getting to 500 followers over there. So if you aren't already following, please be sure to check it out. There'll be a lot of good leagues going on, some fun stuff. And if we hit 1,000 followers, we'll have a 12-hour stream coming up as well. Next up, if you check the link down below, you'll see a link to the Discord. We have over 150 people in there talking about spoilers for Streets of New Capenna. We have Pioneer discussions, lots of good things going on over there. So if you're interested in joining the community, please be sure to follow the link down below. Now let's jump right into this week's tier list. Looking back to start, we have the decks that fell off the tier list. These decks put up finishes last week that qualified them for the tier list, but this week didn't manage to repeat. So we have Jund Citadel. This is the version that runs 4 collected companies, almost all these small 1 to 3 drop creatures, and 4 Bolas's Citadel. Grixis Lutry, carried last week by Sam Ralph, but unfortunately unable to repeat this time. Blue-Green Stompy, unsurprisingly, had a surprise showing last week, but again, unable to repeat from a prelim this week. Mono-Green Karn finally falls off the list after pretty repeatedly showing up, but trending down, unfortunately, due to the hard control decks, Phoenix, and other bad matchups picking up steam. 5-color Humans finally also falls off the list. It had been sort of hovering in that D tier. This week, no results. I'm sure it will end up back on the list, just like Mono-Green Karn and Jund Citadel. But for now, didn't quite make the cut. Last up, we have Banned Spirits, another deck that has been showing up a lot in leagues. I've been playing against it a little bit more as people are attacking some of the controlling and mid-range decks, but with the massive spike in Rakdos decks, unsurprised to see the Spirit decks struggling a little bit this week. Next up, we move on to the F&M tier. These are the decks that managed to get a qualifying finish, however, unlikely to repeat, as well as probably be able to do well at your local F&M, but I wouldn't expect them to show up in the top 16s of any events regularly. First up, we have Gates. This is a deck that comes and goes. It shows up in the 5-0 list pretty often. It's a good deck at being able to manage the board through Gates Ablaze, and you have Guild Summit to be able to use as a draw engine, but you're still a little bit clunky and a worse over-the-top deck than most other options. Next up, we have Fire of Invention's Planeswalkers. This is a deck that I've played before. I believe I played it to a top 32 of a challenge. It is a sweet one where you sort of leverage the ability of the Jeskai Planeswalkers builds with Fire of Inventions, but you also get to play some of the black and green Planeswalkers as you like. Gives you a lot of optionality, and again, Planeswalkers being one of the more powerful things you can be doing, especially for free, but all of the Fires of Invention decks sort of suffer from not being able to interact meaningfully when you need to, and the Planeswalkers in Pioneer, though strong, don't always close out the game immediately and can leave some openings for decks to fight back. Next up, we have Red-White Feather, another deck that is mostly championed by 1 or 2 consistent players. It'll show up here or there, but it's still not in a great position ever since the Luris ban. Next up, we have Red-Black Bloodhall returning to the F&M tier. Again, Ekros's Red-Black Blood deck playing Bloodhall Priest is another version of the Rakdos decks, but it's hard to look at the other more consistent Rakdos decks and put this anywhere higher than F&M tier. Next up, we have Blue-White Spirits, another one of the Spirit variants, again, a little bit more streamlined. in its interaction, then the Bant Spirits version is pretty much the only reason I expect it to show up at all. But again, I think of the Spirits variants, Mono Blue Spirits is the one you want to be playing right now. Finally, we have a new deck that sort of broke onto the scene last week and this week, and that is Neomachus. It is leveraging the Delve creatures, Hooting Mandrill and Tassiger, to be able to get 6 drops out quickly, and then you neoform them into Velomachus Lorehold. We saw Velomachus do some interesting things in Modern with Time Walk. Now, by making it a 6/6, you're able to cast Karn's Temporal Sundering, as well as Part the Water Veil, and just combo kill your opponent in one turn. It's a little bit fragile. It's been putting out 5-0s. It did top 16 a challenge this week. Big reason it made it onto the list, but I am curious to see how this deck develops. Kind of creature combos are usually less resilient than the spell-based combos in Pioneer, but I am curious to see if people will start to tune this deck into a better position. So before we jump into the tiers proper, let's just give a quick rundown of the data sources we're using for this week. So to qualify for the list, you need to have finished with a 4-0 or a 3-1 in a Magic Online prelim, a 5-0 or a 4-1 in the Mox Last Chance qualifier, a top 16 in either of the challenges from the past weekend, or, and this is a special event, sort of like the Super PTQs that come and go, you need a top 14 in the Mox Showcase. The reason why it's top 14, not top 16, is because it was a small event, only 28 players, and the top 14 finished 3, 2, or better. I didn't want to include 2, 2, and 3 decks just based on breakers of a 5-round tournament, so it is only going to include decks that finished with a positive record. First up, we have D tier. These are the decks that will show up, will be able to sometimes put up a top 16, are more likely to be prelim style decks, and are a little bit above F&M tier. They are competitively aimed as far as where I would expect them to be finishing, but I would be surprised to see any of these lists make a top 8 in a challenge. First up, we have a new deck to the list, that is Jeskai Ascendancy combo. Again, a new addition that likes to attack some of the decks that are playing to the board, because you can more or less ignore the board. You get to play a couple of pieces of interactions in Portable Hole, Chain to the Rocks, and sometimes Red Removal, but primarily you are a consistent turn 4 or 5 combo deck, similar to Lotus Field, but you have a good sideboard plan against the decks that try to attack your spell-based combo by bringing in Monastery Mentor. You have a lot of ability to survive against the aggro decks, and when decks like Mono Red show up to attack Lotus Field, I do like the pivot into something like Jeskai Ascendancy for combo players. However, the deck still struggles with a lot of the same things that are good right now. Skilled pilots will be able to navigate things like the blue-white control matchup and the Phoenix matchup, but they are still close, if not favorable, to those decks. And the rise of the discard decks is always going to be tough. Next up, we have Mono Black Aggro. Honestly, I think this deck comes and goes, but without cards like Smuggler's Copter, you do sort of end up a slower, somewhat clunkier Mono Red with the advantage of more discard and hard removal. I don't think that is what the aggro decks need right now. I think you just need to get your opponent dead. But in reality, I think this style of aggro deck is not as well prepared for the meta, especially since one of your best matchups previously was blue-white control. And as I've said, March of the Otherworldly Light does make a lot of your recursive creatures inert. Next up, we have Jund Sacrifice. This is a return to D tier. Again, the Jund decks in the format right now, I think, are just a little bit in the wrong position as far as the mid-range decks go. The other mid-range decks tend to be able to kill just a little bit quicker against the combo decks and are able to be resilient enough to not die to the aggro decks, whereas the Jund Sacrifice decks sort of don't do anything to such a degree that they're able to punish the top decks. And across the board, it feels like you have a bad matchup against the S tier, and that's just not something you can realistically win with. Next up, we have the C tier. These are the decks that will likely show up in the challenges. If you told me that they managed to top 8, I wouldn't be shocked, but if they were pushing for a victory, that would be a little bit more rare. They can obviously spike, but again, this is the cut point where I would be aiming, if my goal was to win a challenge, to be playing decks above C tier. And I think C and D tier are the decks that, if you're a specialist in them, you'll overperform, but realistically, the average pilot is not going to be top 8ing with these kind of decks. First up, a return to the C tier, Mono Blue Spirits. This deck continues to show up primarily in the hands of Hero over on Magic Online, while Hero like Claudio with Niv-to-Light shows up in the results almost every week. The average Mono Blue Spirits player is not putting up the same level of results. It's difficult to ever move a deck above C tier when it can only be piloted by the absolute best of that archetype to put up the same or worse results than the average pilots do with other decks. Next up, we have Esper Greasefang. This is new to the list. Previously, we had other versions of Greasefang in this slot, but Esper Greasefang put up some solid results this weekend, including a 3rd/4th place finish in the challenge on Saturday. I think the Esper Greasefang deck is still on average a little bit worse than the Mardu Greasefang, but as people continue to tweak it a little, there is a lot of playability, especially with Esper being one of the shards in Streets of New Capenna. However, I think the problems with Esper Greasefang are that your backup plan is to be a control deck, and you are a worse control deck than just either of the mainstay control decks of the format, and your first game plan is slower than the Mardu or the Abzan version. Next up, we have more Greasefang, this time Mardu. It retains its spot in C tier. Like I said, I think the Blood package as your main plan is a better game 1 plan, with the fallback plan of the Greasefang Parhelion. I think going all in on the Parhelion strategy is a little bit tough. I think if people continue to have graveyard hate, the Greasefang decks will struggle to get above C tier. However, with consistent top 8 finishes or top 16 finishes, it's hard not to include Greasefang as a powerful card and staple in the format. Next up, let's look at B tier. These are the decks that I think are starting to struggle among the top echelons. Oftentimes they are decks that have a poor weekend despite being pretty consistent outside of that. I think they are pretty likely to be making your top 8s, but again, my thought process is that if your goal was to win the tournament, a B tier deck is usually going to be a metagame call, but it is unlikely to be winning the event, or if it does win the event, that might be the only finish it sees for the weekend. First up, we have a drop from S tier, and that is Lotus Field, which, as I said, did win the challenge on Saturday, and that was about it. Had one other finish for the whole weekend. 2 finishes is a very low amount. For reference, we had 13, 12, 8 as far as S tier type finishes. So to only have 2 in a whole weekend is pretty shocking. But with the rise of red-black mid-range, with the rise of decks like Phoenix really prioritizing sideboard slots with Invasive Surgery, Alpine Moon, decks are starting to come for Lotus Field. And Lotus Field, though being a very resilient deck, a very strong deck, will still be a deck that you can target and choose to try and attack. I think it will take a couple weeks for Lotus Field hate to sort of fade, but for now, Lotus Field is right in the target of most top decks, and that is not a place that a combo deck wants to sit. Next up, we have Red-Black Sacrifice, previously of A tier. I think right now, Red-Black Midrange continues to prove to be the Rakdos deck of choice. I think Red-Black Sacrifice is still a great choice. It just doesn't have the same matchup spread that Red-Black Midrange does, and with the rise of Blue-White Yorion over Blue-White Control, the 60-card version, extra farewells, cards like that are really problems for the Oni-Cult engines, Oni-Cult Anvil strategies, and I think that even though you are probably favored into the blue-red control deck that's been seeing a lot of play lately, it's a lot closer than you'd like because your interaction is mostly interacting with creatures or a little bit with the hand, and you don't quite have the same mid-game stayability outside of your own recursive engines. Next up, we have A tier. These are the decks that are your favorites to be making top 8. They are also likely pushing to win a challenge. They put up strong results week in and week out, and they are only held back by their general issues with the S tier decks. These are usually decks that will start moving up into the S tier deck, or they will break and move back down to B tier. But this is sort of the S tier waiting room. They're usually great choices, and as they develop, we'll see if they can reach that top pinnacle spot. First up in A tier, we have blue-red control up from C tier last week after weeks and weeks of 1 or 2 top 8s, a lot of top 16s. This blue-red control deck, leveraging Narset, Parter of Veils, and Days Undoing, along with plenty of red removal, put up 5 top 8s out of 2 challenges. This deck is getting stronger by the weekend, and I think people are starting to figure out how to best play the matchup spreads of the S tier. If this deck continues to put up results like this, it will be S tier very shortly. Next up, we have Mono Red, previously B tier. Again, with the drop of Lotus Field, Mono Red is a big proponent of why that happened. Probably the best true aggro deck in the format. It does suffer a little bit from Phoenix and Winota still picking up a lot of ground along with red-black midrange, but if we see more and more decks that are trying to attack those decks, slowing down a little bit, Mono Red retains its ability to get under those decks. However, it will be tough for Mono Red to ever move into the S tier as long as decks like red-black midrange and blue-red Phoenix are at the top of the meta. Next up, we have the S tier. These are the decks that are likeliest to win an event. If they don't make at least 1 to 2 slots in the top 8 in a weekend, it is somewhat of a shock. They are putting up 5 to 10 or more qualifying finishes a weekend. These are your top echelon decks of the format. First up, we have red-black midrange, which was A tier last week. It's put up massive results the last 2 weeks. In my article over on mtgmeta.io, I said last week that I would be playing red-black midrange, and it put up the most finishes with 13 this weekend. It did a great job of putting people into the top 8. It was one of the most consistent top finishers. Where it struggled was closing the deal. It came in a lot of 3rd, 4ths, a lot of 5th, 8ths. Unfortunately, it just couldn't quite close out many of the important events, and I think that is the one thing that keeps red-black midrange from truly sitting in S tier often, is that you do have some trouble against the other S tier decks, especially blue-white control and Phoenix, if the builds continue to go the way they have been lately. Next up, we have blue-red Phoenix, which of the top decks did not have a great weekend as far as the number of finishes, with only 5 qualifying finishes, but the quality of those finishes absolutely manages to push blue-red into the top echelon, with a 2nd place finish in the challenge on Sunday, a 3rd and 4th place finish on the challenge on Saturday, a 1st and 2nd in the mocks. It is the undisputed deck for winning events in Pioneer right now, though other decks will dethrone it week to week. If you are trying to win an event, often playing the best list of Phoenix is the #1 chance you have to actually come in first. Next up, we have blue-white control, which stays in S tier yet again with another suite of top finishes. It continues to be the best control deck in the format, though with the rise of blue-red control, we are starting to see some jostling between which control deck is best. However, the access to Teferi, Supreme Verdict, Farewell, and Rest in Peace, and the Wandering Emperor are all major reasons that blue-white control continues to be the dominant control deck in the format. Last up from A tier, we have Winota with another strong weekend, bouncing back from struggling against all the red-black decks last weekend. Winota put up 12 top finishes. Again, a strong performance for getting to the top 8, putting up strong, consistent results. But similar to Red Black Midrange, Winota had trouble closing out those events. It is a great deck for punishing some of the lesser fine decks, some of the decks in the lower tiers, but against Phoenix, against Blue Eye Control, against Red Black Midrange, you will sometimes struggle. You do have top draws that can beat anyone, and especially if you run into some of the slower decks or the combo decks that don't interact with you, like Lotus Field, you're in a great shape. But Winota is one of the decks that plays the matchup lottery the hardest in the format. But if you hit your matchups well, you will dominate, and if you don't, you tend to run into lightning axes face first, and you'll struggle. So with that, we have our tier list for the week. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Be sure to check out my Twitch stream over at twitch.tv/darthjacen. Be live every Monday, Thursday, and Sunday moving forward. And until next time, thanks. Hey there. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this content on either Twitch or YouTube. If you did, please like or subscribe. If you didn't, be sure to leave a comment down below. I promise not to read it. Until next time.